All right. Welcome everyone to debate night here in the Constitutional Patriots Discord server. I am Young Patriot. I will be hosting this debate. I'll be moderating. It is between Ace of Cards and Tacitus. The debate topic is the American left rooted in domestic terrorism? Ace of Cards is taking the stance that the American left is rooted in domestic terrorism, and Tacitus is pushing back and saying that they are not. So how this is going to work is you guys are going to have opening statements that are going to be 3 minutes, and then you're going to have rebuttals that will also be 3 minutes. Now, I give a little bit of grace period, and honestly, I don't want to be talking much at all. I want it to be between the two of you, and I think the two of you are obviously mature adults. So the two of you will be able to just interject, basically. If you start interrupting, talking over each other, I'll have to mute. But I think you guys can, once you finish talking, the other one just steps in, right? I think you guys can handle it. But if not, then I'll have to step in. And then after you guys are done with your opening and your rebuttals, we will then go to some questions. People here can ask questions. You can send me a question to ask, or you can actually just type it in the chat, what have you. And then after that, you guys will have a closing statement, which will be 3 minutes as well. Are you guys ready?
Yep.
Okay. All right, Ace, you can get us started.
Right. Well, my position is pretty clear. I believe that the American left, or the left-wing ideologues, I'll call them, their entire movement is rooted in domestic terrorism. Basically what that means, domestic terror in the United States is defined under federal law, involves acts dangerous to human life that are in violation of criminal laws of the United States or any state, appears and or intended to intimidate or coerce a civilian population, influence policy of the government by intimidation or coercion, or affect the conduct of a government by mass destruction, assassination, and or kidnapping. In the United States, in the last, I'd say probably 10 to 15 years, we have seen quite the rise of left-wing groups, NGOs, political parties, and whatnot, that I believe are in direct violation of domestic terrorism laws, which would qualify them as domestic terrorists. You have groups like Black Lives Matter, Antifa, a lot of the individuals in the Democrat Party, online political pundits that, to this very day, engage in activity that is, under law, in my opinion, domestic terrorism. They use violence, they use coercion, and they use threats of violence against the civilian population who are either politically or not politically involved, as well as the actual other political parties and people on the right, center, whatever, to coerce them into going along with what they believe and what they want. You have the political parties of the Democrats and then those who are involved in politics on the left who will engage in those similar activities through, again, coercion, destruction of property, murder, assassinations, and intimidation. They do this openly. They have made it quite obvious that they are engaging in that for the explicit reason to either harm those that they disagree with, or through threats of violence or committing acts of violence to push their political agenda and their ideology on those who do not agree with them and force them to come to heel. And in doing so, they will also engage in online discourse and use very similar tactics to essentially cudgel those into stifling any type of debate, any type of opposition, by painting them as racists, as Nazis, white supremacists, the list goes on. And I feel that it qualifies as domestic terrorists.
All right, test this whenever you're ready.
Right on. Yes, the question here today is whether or not leftism, the American left, is rooted in domestic terrorism. Today, I argue in the negative. Political violence, in my opinion, owes no allegiance except to the barbarians who wield it under the false pretenses of justice and revolution. I'm not going to engage in this idea that speech, which is protected, somehow is equivalent to acts of domestic terrorism. So again, we're asked today whether or not the American left is rooted in domestic terrorism. If words would have any meaning at all, I think we have to reject that notion. I'd reject it just on its face, but I've got to give some proof behind that. Not least of which because the question implies that one half of the political spectrum is inherently violent, perhaps more so than the other half. But it also places a greater emphasis on the means to ends over the actual roots of many elements of what constitutes the overall left in America, and it completely ignores motive. If all it takes to be considered terrorism is the presence of fear as a consequence of an action, then we ought to abolish all crime, murder, theft, vandalism, whatever you want, and simply convict people on the amount of fear their actions cause in the community. If that sounds absurd, that's because it is, but it would be the logical foundation that justifies any notion that domestic terrorism is a root philosophical driver behind the left in America. Um, I digress on that point, but I think in order to support this stance, I really intend to just give a brief overview of liberalism and its philosophers, addressing differences between the kinds of political violence, because I think there's a fundamental difference between revolutionary violence, guerrilla warfare, uh, and domestic terrorism. Um, I think we can't just conflate the three. I don't think it's appropriate to say, well, some keyboard clack warrior said this one thing that I didn't like that upset me. It must be terrorism. Um, if we go with that logic, then literally nothing has meaning. Everything means the same. Um, and so I'll conclude eventually. I think I'm just making a final point regarding political violence in general. But I think in order to really have a debate to answer this question, to say yes or no, is to really define what liberalism is. What is the American left? What does that constitute? Is it an umbrella? Is it not? I think it's an umbrella. And I think we also need to define what domestic terrorism is, which there's an idea of it, but there is no charge of domestic terrorism. There are crimes associated with it that stem from the Patriot Act and that the FBI uses, but no one is charged with domestic terrorism. That charge doesn't exist, and so I think I think we also need to look at intent and motive. And I think we need to be careful not to paint broad strokes against our political opponents, lest we just become the barbarians that wield these things under false pretenses.
Right on. Going forward, you guys just start whenever you're ready after the other one finishes, and I'll get the time going.
Okay, I think as a maybe a point of matter here, I will mute. So like once you see my mute button, that's a clear for go.
Okie dokie. So the basis for why I think the left is rooted in domestic terrorism is pretty simple and straightforward. You have groups that, like Antifa, Black Lives Matter, and plenty of Democrats who, over I'd say probably the last 10 to 15 years, have increasingly become more volatile with their rhetoric. They have publicly on news, in Congress, on social media platforms, they have openly called for people to go out and attack those that they disagree with. People on the right, Trump supporters, quote unquote, make America great again movement, conservatives. Antifa specifically, as we have seen over the last 10 to 15 years, it's not a structured group. It's decentralized. You have people who just slap the I'm Antifa sticker on them, what we say. Specifically in places like Seattle and in Washington and Oregon, we have seen black bloc militants. So that's what they are. They're armed with various types of weapons, and they will go out and they will physically attack, harm, and attempt to kill or kill those they disagree with. Specifically for Antifa in the last couple of years, we've seen with the whole transgender movement, that type of social change that they want. People who disagree with them they come out and protest against various laws that are being passed to either allow or disallow biological men from being in sports or being using the bathrooms that they want. People will go out and protest, but then you have Antifa will come out and quote unquote counter protest, but in doing so, they will attack them, they will assault and batter them, and they will use violence to essentially coerce them to saying, no, you can't disagree with me. If you do, I will physically attack you and try to kill you. That those acts that they commit would meet the very straightforward definition of domestic terrorism. They're using coercion, they're using violence to influence not only government policy, but the civilian population to go along with what they say under threat of being attacked, and not even just the threat of actual evidence of being attacked for disagreeing with their quote unquote protest, like they call it, when it's not a protest. Under the Supreme Court precedent of the Brandenburg test for any type of free speech, any type of speech that direct that leads to direct incitement or producing imminent lawless action is not covered under the First Amendment. You go on
That's it. Your
saying I
time's up.
disagree with
Your
you.
time's up. Your time's up.
Okay.
I think just as a quick rebuttal here, I think it's important that we not conflate volatile rhetoric, which was given no definition, but assuming we take it at face value, is not the same thing as domestic terrorism. Volatile rhetoric for one person might be totally fine to another. Uh, you know, the words that Jesus spoke were volatile rhetoric, according to Romans. So I think we need to skip the ambiguity here, and I think in the same spirit we need to not paint broad strokes, which is what I already said. And I think when we point to Antifa, it's really easy to just say, well, Antifa is the whole picture of the left. Well, the Antifa is not the American left; it's a small minority, and you rightfully point out that they are a decentralized group of people. Uh, but the American left is a pretty centralized group of people. It's a very large umbrella with a broad array of beliefs, from Antifa to your. I mean, I'm blanking, but I mean, there's no such thing as a conservative Democrat anymore. We haven't had those since what, 1998, 2006, somewhere in there. Um, so I don't think it's fair to bring Antifa to suggest that somehow this is evidence that the American left is rooted in domestic terrorism. Um, this goes back to a point I was going to say about differentiating between liberalisms. Uh, Conservatives are classical liberals, or neoliberalism is a different thing. I'm not going to dive into that, but you know, what the current left is, we should define as modern liberalism, and that predates fascism, that predates Antifa. And Antifa started off as a way to combat, like the things you're saying about they show up and they counter protest. Yes, but the same right wing groups do the same thing to them. For every time that a conservative shows up and Antifa shows up, the same thing can be said. So I don't think we need to get into a tit for tat debate about how the extreme right and left just knuckle up in the streets, because I don't think that is the root of either side. And I think when we get back to what it means to have a root, it means, is domestic terrorism the backbone? Is it what defines the left? It doesn't. It doesn't define either side. And in fact, modern liberalism, what defines the left with the New Deal, is a branch of elements from classical liberalism, specifically to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I can quote FDR, I can quote Kennedy, I can quote Woodrow Wilson. These people did not believe in violence, but what they did believe was that the government was there for a concept of positive rights. What that meant was that, unlike classical liberals who believe in negative rights, your negative rights basically means the government needs to not interfere. That's how my rights are protected. Modern left, modern liberalism, which is the majority of the Democratic Party, and most people who vote for Democrats believe that the government is there to protect the rights. The government says what it is. I'm not saying whether that's right or wrong, but that's the difference, and that's where the root is.
Okay, you finished right when I was about to say your time's up.
So, in regard to the fact that you're saying that it's rooted in liberalism and the government should be involved to protect your rights, I can understand that, and I do agree with that. However, where I think that it's where I come from of saying that the left is rooted in domestic terrorism is that people who are on the left, like Antifa, BLM, and all these activists, they see any type of government um, protections, or not say protections, but the government being taking their hands off, saying we're not going to do this, or we're changing this policy. They take it as, instead of them just taking their hands off and letting other people decide, they see it as an existential threat to those rights, which they are not. And when you have Democrats and people on the left saying they are taking our rights away, it then gives them justification to then go out and quite literally fight for their quote unquote rights they're losing. And I'm not arguing, or I'm not saying that just them saying you need to be going out and resist or whatever is domestic terrorism. It's the fact is that the people who listen to them, they see what these politicians and the people they follow online are saying. Oh, we're living in a fascist country now because Trump's doing this or that with this policy, or they're doing this or that with this specific law, or they're passing these laws. They then use that to essentially um, springboard and tell the people who follow them, like, you if you do not fight this, like actually go out and fight this, you are going to lose that right. And then when the wave won, we're now living under Hitler again. We're living under Mussolini and fascist Italy. And they use the thing of, oh, I'm just speaking, I'm not actually telling people to go out. Well, no, when you tell somebody who genuinely believes that these are rights that if they pass this law, they lose that right, they then see that saying, go out and resist them. Well, they take it to the 10th level and they go out and they assault you. They try to kill you because they think that if you take this quote unquote right away, they are no longer able to live. And in regards to the trans thing, is that these people who are specifically transgender, they're told, oh, if they take away this right, that's a genocide against you. They're going to come kill you. So to them, they're thinking, oh, if I don't go out and stop this and get rid of this threat, like actually get rid of it and harm you or kill you, I'm going to die. It's a life, or it's kill or be killed, essentially. So while they're not actively endorsing violence, because these people are, in my opinion, mentally unwell and unhinged, they take what they say of go out and protest and resist them to mean I need to fight for my life. I will attack and harm you to protect myself.
Um, so you're giving an example. You said if you don't go out and fight this, you will lose your rights. How is that any different than anybody on any part of the political spectrum? I can parse out so many examples of 2A. I remember a time when the NRA was for background checks, but now you've got Wayne LaPierre going up there and he's saying things like, well, if we strengthen background checks, you're going to lose your right to firearms. How is that any different, my dude? Like the fundamental basis behind classical liberalism, not even modern. I'm talking about uh, Adam Smith. I'm talking about the people that founded this country. They would have said the same thing. They didn't just say it; they did something about it. They didn't just challenge the notion of an existential threat. They called it out and they challenged it with violence when necessary. I'm also going to point out that you said that BLM is not actively advocating violence. Those were your exact words. If we look at the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project, which I haven't vetted, but according to them, They recorded over 10,000 BLM demonstrations across 2,700 locations, with 95% of those events being peaceful. So if we're to take everything that you just said about BLM, that they do not advocate violence. In fact, they have advocated publicly about nonviolence. Um, and the vast majority, the overwhelming majority have been peaceful. How can we say that they're an example of a violent group? Like that doesn't, the reality here doesn't even support the notion that they are rooted in violence. And even if we go even deeper onto the ideas about the existential threat of systems, that founding fathers fought against a very awful system, uh, and they won. Um, it seems to me that we're arguing over whether or not volatile rhetoric is for our side or not. The last I checked, protest is a perfectly valid form of speech. To go out into the street and protest, to go out into the street and protest loudly with profanity isn't domestic terrorism. And that's just the First Amendment right. Is it appropriate? Is it respectful? Is it with candor? Who cares? It's a First Amendment right. And unless actual crimes are being committed, I don't think that it's fair to even use BLM as an example to support what you're trying to claim is a root of the American left. The BLM doesn't represent the American left in its entirety. American left is a broad tent, just like conservatism.
When you cite the that project with BLM, for example, you said that 95% of them are quote unquote peaceful, right? Back during this 2020, the quote unquote summer of love, as they love to call it online, and all the people in the media love to call it, you had BLM protests, quote unquote, that led to over $2 billion in property damage. I think I'm just quoting off the top of my head, so I'm not sure if it's accurate, right? 15 or 20 people were murdered during those BLM riots, like riots. These police officers and these agents that are there protecting property just because of an injustice that they found.
Domestic terrorism is a very planned out, coordinated event against non state actors. And riots can often be against state actors. It can be about getting heard. I think the intent and the motive behind it is not the same. I don't think that many riots start with the intention of ending anybody's life. Property damage, yes, property damage just happens during a riot. You want to talk about scale? Whether it's $1 or 2 billion, I don't know that I'm going to convince you that a riot isn't the same thing as domestic terrorism. But again, you're kind of sidestepping this. Question is domestic terrorism a root of the American left? No, it isn't. Um, uh, Modern liberalism evolved from classical liberalism, which I said before. I don't know if y'all need me to define what classical liberalism is, but really it's about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It is about fundamentally natural rights, and it's about government not saying what I can or can't do unless there's harm. It's about free market capitalism. It's about rights being protected through non-intervention. Modern liberalism, which we use for some reason we have evolved to have liberalism meaning three different things. But modern liberalism or social liberalism basically says we can have those rights, but the government has to protect it. That's why we have economic protectionism. But the founding philosophy
was not. However, as politics evolves, I see it as it used to be from that standpoint of it. It's everything you pointed out that it wasn't based in violence and domestic terrorism. But the modern day left and the left that we see today is, in fact, it is rooted in domestic terrorism and violence. It's just simple as that because every single group, I know I keep going back to Antifa and BLM because that's just the easiest one to point out because of how it is. Through everyone involved, they directly intimidated and coerced the civilian population to go along with their government policy change of wanting to defund the police. They did not want police around. So what do? The people on the left, the politicians, they all said when you defund the police, when you go out and protest, which turned to riots, and they essentially were passing laws now to defund the police because if they weren't, they knew what happened in Minneapolis and all these other states would happen in their state. They directly coerced the civilian population to go along with it, and they influenced the policy of the government to pass laws to defund the police and to reduce the police forces and change things with the police force. And there's a way to do it correctly, but they didn't do it correctly. They used violence and riots and engaged actively in domestic terrorism to influence government policy and to get people to either agree with them or if they didn't disagree with them, they threatened them. They said, we're going to do the same thing we're going to do that we did in Minneapolis. We're going to burn the cities down and we're going to cause, they called it protesting, but it wasn't protests. Under any what's what I'm looking for? Classical understanding of freedom of speech. You can protest whatever you want as long as it does not lead to direct or incitement of direct violence. What they were saying during the whole 2020 riots was directly inciting people to go out, commit lawless actions, and they did. And we have a multitude of history to show that for the last 5 years since 2020. I mean, multiple people were murdered. Murder's illegal, duh. They rioted, that's illegal. They caused billions of dollars in property damage, that's also illegal. So while they didn't say go out and burn the cities down, the people on the left, in my understanding of the modern interpretation that I have of it,
Time's up.
is that
I'm gonna share a poll here in the chat. That's from NPR, and essentially it's showing that Americans, I think 1,300 plus adults, were asked in 2024 whether or not Americans may have to resort to violence in order to get to the country back on track. Um, from March 24 to September 25, Democrats increased from 12 to 28%. So just factual. This is consistent with CSIS, that's also measuring that. I think for the first part of 2025, or yeah, 2025, for the first time in 30 years, there was more, I think, plots from left wing violence as opposed to right wing. Um, but this also shows that Republicans went from 28 to 31%. This is what this is showing. And it shows at about the same percent. 71% of Democrats and 69% of Republicans disagree with this notion. So I'm sharing this to kind of point out, because you're painting this idea that the left wing is just inherently violent, that they're just like going out and burning down the streets because they just, f everybody I disagree with. But I think it's also like this profound generalization that you're doing, along with this recency effect. And the recency effect isn't even really applicable because you're talking about stuff that is 6 years old. You're using the most extreme examples, but the vast majority of people, literally two-thirds of people, do not agree with violence. And so if we're going to say, well, the left is violent, well, we have to agree that the right is too. And so now we get back to this point that it's just another tit for tat. It's just Antifa versus the far right. It's just Antifa versus the fascists. It's I fundamentally, I was going to say this for my closing, but I think political violence, I said this before too. I think political violence is not beholden to any ideology, but fundamentally, I think that it is a failure of politics. And so, Ace, when you come in here, and I have gone ballistic over some of the things you said in this chat, is you're lamenting this idea of like volatile language, but you've made comments about locking up everybody that is on the left. But like most people on the left don't agree with violence. They don't. Um, you're talking about how like BLM and all these people wanted to riot and burn down the cities. BLM is just as decentralized. Yes, I've seen that left wing terror attacks and plots in the United States. Totally see that. I also see that that's 0 to 8, so less than 10 plots per year. Show me what the conservative one is. Show me what right wing is. Let's compare and contrast our little graphs there. I'm not contending that left hasn't increased. I am, in fact, demonstrating that point. But that doesn't mean that violence is the root. In fact, I think people just don't know how to disagree anymore. I think that is the fundamental root cause of this. It isn't a belief that domestic terrorism is the way to go. And one last thing about this quote 2020 Summer of Love, which you're the second person I've heard call 2020 the Summer of Love. I understand Summer of Love to be a 1960s event. Some of that property damage was done by right wing people too, and other people not related to BLM.
Time is up.
so I'm just trying to organize my thoughts here. Well, I do agree that yes, it's not I'm not only saying that it's just the left that is responsible, because that would be disingenuous and that would be ignorant to the fact is that yes, there are right-wing terrorists in terrorist groups that do exist and have done the very thing that the left has done. Yes. However, where I would counter to that is saying that in the last 5 to 10 years, we'll say, or 5 years even, we have seen more plots of violence against those on the right by people on the left. You have Trump being nearly assassinated 3 or 4 times now, and the people who were involved are either dead because they killed themselves or they were arrested and they were put in prison, rightfully so. You have the murder of Charlie Kirk, who was assassinated by a person who, for all intents and purposes, was a left wing individual who disagreed with him. And instead of having a debate with him, he went out and murdered him, assassinated him in public. And I would say that, sure, is it a failure of politics? Yes. However, we're not seeing people during the era of Biden when people were calling him like dementia Biden or sleepy Joe Biden. They weren't going out and trying to murder him. They didn't have people trying to shoot Biden in the head. They didn't have people going out shooting left wing political commentators and activists. The only times we have seen that in the last 5 years has been against those on the right wing, conservatives, and Trump. So when you have people that are saying, "Well, we're just protesting, we're just saying, we're using our free First Amendment rights," sure, they are. However, because of how tribalistic it is, in the last 5 years, 10 years, that people who are on the left take what is being said and they are so extreme that then they go out and resort to these acts of domestic terrorism and violence. And you don't see that with on the right. You see the pockets of like the Proud Boys and the other people, the far right groups. Yes, I will definitely agree that they do those things, but not to the level that we see on the left. Day in and day out, you can look across all social medias, and even in Minneapolis recently with the whole ICE protests, you didn't see people going out during Biden's administration and doing this because he wasn't enforcing immigration. No, the people were protesting. People went out and tried to petition the government to change policy. But now, during Trump's administration, you people going out actively fighting, obstructing, and trying to kill ICE agents because what they are seeing is that, oh, they call in Congress all the time, all day, every day, seems like. They're saying, well, ICE can't do this. It's illegal. Well, they can. They are legally allowed to enforce immigration law. It's federal immigration law. But then you have people being told by these groups and these organizations that are actively organizing in groups and in signal chats to go out and attack and
Time's
obstruct
up.
and
Yeah, my guy, I gotta disagree. I think your broad stroke here. You're talking about tribalism. I think we like tribalism. Tribal politics is again beholden to no ideology. I find anarcho-capitalists to be the most tribal of them all, frankly. Um, no offense to any ANCAPs in here, but and I also want to say political violence, attempting to kill a president, attempting to kill anybody like Gabby Giffords, uh, absolutely inappropriate. But you're here talking about how like, well, the right never does that. Well, I'm looking at the same article that you're talking about that you're citing, and I'm just going to point out that the right between 2016 and 25, the same article that you copied and pasted this, or I'm sorry, Unhinged showed this. Sorry, um, right killed 112 people as opposed to 13 from the left. Number of attacks 152 from the right, as opposed to 32. I'm sorry, 35 from the left. Um, right-leaning attackers are generally more lethal. That's just a fact. Um, and the other thing is Nancy Pelosi was attacked. If you don't remember, um, share that link. Politicians have been getting assassinated and attempted to be assassinated since we've had politics, since that word existed in Greek. And I don't think it's genuine or fair or accurate or appropriate to come in here and be like, well, this is only a matter of the left, which I think you've already conceded. But you keep coming back to this idea of using the worst examples. But the other thing that I really want to point out from this article, the left-wing terrorism and political violence, really quick, is what's causing the rise. When we look at domestic terrorism, that is an act against non-state actors in order to create fear in the community. The increase in left-wing incidents, quote from this article, in the past decade is driven by plots and attacks directed at government and law enforcement targets. I'm not saying, I guess I am saying, I think when we need to get back to our definitions here, those acts are not meant to instill fear in the populace. It's meant to instill fear in the government. And I think to these people, their intent is for this to be viewed and treated and seen and felt as revolutionary. But I also don't think it's the vast majority. Even BLM doesn't agree with this. BLM is about as decentralized as Antifa. Probably somewhere between that and the 99% movement. The point is it is decentralized. So one group in one state may believe in this violent act, whereas the majority don't. And so I think when we look at intent, we still don't get to this place where it's rooted in domestic terrorism.
Time's up.
So where I'm coming from, where I disagree with that, and like you said before, how I've said some things in chat that like we should lock these people up. Where I'm basing it off of is the fact is that by what they're doing, they are meeting the definition under the FBI's definition, DHS's definition, and the government's definition of what domestic terrorism is. That's a criminal offense. So I'm not saying just round everybody up because they're on the left. I'm saying they're committing crimes. They're committing acts of domestic terrorism. Therefore, they are criminals and they should be locked up. The people that go out and say these things online and in Congress and all that stuff that incite people to carry out these acts should be held responsible for what they say because it's not freedom of speech at that point. To me, what they're doing is it would not meet this. It would meet the standard of the Brandenburg test for unlawful speech that's not covered under the First Amendment. So therefore, it's not a First Amendment violation. They are directly inciting acts of violence and acts of domestic terrorism. When they go and say you should fight these people, you should do these things to oppose them. And sure, are they opposing the government? Yes. However, when they're doing that, they're also coercing and causing fear in the general populace who has no intention of being involved at all. When you have people in Minnesota, for example, like how I brought up the ICE thing, sure, they're opposing ICE. They don't want them to do their thing. However, they're letting these violent, illegal criminals out into the public again. They're not keeping them in jail. They're not keeping them and handing them over to ICE and letting them be deported. No, they're releasing them, which then forces ICE to go out into the community to find them. And then you have the people on the left who oppose this. They then obstruct, they get involved, they start attacking ICE. So now you not only have the people who are attacking ICE being, in my opinion, rightfully arrested, and if they resort to acts of violence, then we see what happens. They get what they get. But you have people who are not involved, who are just trying to go about their daily lives. Now they're under constant threat of having their way of life ruined because they're now being sworn by people who are, I call rioting or protesting, quote unquote, because they think that they're an ICE agent. They had in Minneapolis, the left-wing activists literally set up checkpoints that they would check people's ID, make sure that they're not ICE. I don't see how you can look at that and say, well, that's not trying to put fear into the populace. It is. If I'm trying to get to work in the morning and I have to go through some random activist checkpoint where I have a whole bunch of goons there. Let me see your ID. Are you ICE? I'm not involved in ICE. I'm just some bumfuck nobody who's trying to get to work to earn my paycheck. You don't think that instills fear in everybody around them? Or the people that are going day to day, they have to worry about violent criminals being released from prison and they don't know where they are. They're just released into the public. People who are arrested multiple times, have been deported multiple times, who are rapists, murderers, like the violent people that we don't want in our communities are being released, and then ICE is forced to track them down. So I don't see how you can look at that and say that, oh no, it's only the government they're opposing. They're not trying to put fear into the public. I think they are, because that's directly what's happening from the effects of their actions, from the politicians, from the DAs, from people and the
Time.
activists.
Sorry, I don't think I said it loud enough. That's on me.
I said at the start um, that if words have any meaning, then we need to define these things. And I shared your FBI terrorism definition. And I gave a pretty absurd idea that all we would need to do is abolish all crime, and then just measure this based on the level of fear that is committed based on a person's action. I said that would be the logical foundation behind such a premise, and I think you just engaged in that absurdity. You might be afraid of that checkpoint, but a community has a right to do that. I mean, that's how I feel about homeowners associations, man. That's how I feel about gated communities. I don't get scared when I roll up to a gated community because it's trying to keep out violent criminals or people that don't belong there. But I also I'm gonna quote a couple of people. Uh, uh, the accumulation of all powers, legislative, executive, and judiciary, in the same hands may justly be pronounced the very definition of tyranny. James Madison said that. Thomas Paine said, "He that would make his own liberty secure must guard even his enemy from oppression." Um, Benjamin Franklin, "They who can give up essential liberty to obtain a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty or safety." Now you're up here essentially saying that any person who is afraid must be a victim of terrorism. Well, if that's the case, releasing people who are violent criminals that have done their time have now become victims of terrorism, state-sanctioned terrorism for letting these people go. Like that's the logical extreme of what you're saying. I don't think that's exactly what you're trying to say, but that's the logic, like that's the math that we're playing with here. And I think that we have to get back to this. You're talking about these goons just going out and fighting ICE agents. Well, the last I checked, ICE is the government. They are state parties. The people that are actually going and doing this, that are that are doing this, they're thinking that it's totally okay to go and punch a police officer in the face. That isn't like from them. This isn't domestic terrorism. To them, the state is the enemy. To them, the state is exercising tyranny. Like that's their view. And I think when we understand their view, we can get to a place where like, oh, okay, well, these protesters aren't going out and with the intent to burn down innocent people's homes. Their intent is to, with force if necessary, remove the state from a perceived tyrannical action. And I think that if the government decided to come take your guns, you would say let them try. That's the same logic that we're playing with, and you don't have to agree with whether or not like we can debate whether they're right or wrong another time, but that is their premise. That is what is differentiating defensive violence, self-defense versus revolutionary violence versus domestic terrorism.
Time.
I don't agree with that, because what ICE and the government is doing is lawful enforcement of immigration law. People who should not be here who have no right to be here, who should not be here in the first place, are allowed to stay here. They're not coming to take my guns because, or I should say, let me rephrase that. Saying that ICE is here to enforce federal immigration law, which was passed by Congress, signed by the president, is not the same as the government coming to take my guns because they don't want me to have guns. That's not the same thing. They are enforcing federal immigration law. They're arresting criminals who they are criminals because they are here unlawfully without any legal basis to be here. It's not the same as claiming to be it's a tyrannical power of the government to enforce laws because it's not. The Second Amendment guarantees the right to keep and bear arms. We all understand that. But there's no constitutional right for illegal aliens to be here and stay here. They're not. So I don't think you can conflate the government enforcing federal immigration law as tyrannical in the same regard as a actual tyrannical government coming to violate someone's Second Amendment right by taking their guns, because the people who possess guns are lawful owners of firearms. They're allowed to possess them. So I disagree with that fact is that it's somehow the same because it's not. It's two very, very different things. And under current and I hate using the whole, well, it's because it's the Supreme Court says it's lawful, it's lawful. Like I don't want to appeal to legality here because that's a fallacy. But under current Supreme Court precedents, ICE is allowed to operate anywhere in the United States. They're allowed to arrest and deport anyone who's not lawfully present. And under, I think it was Biden v. Texas, during the Biden administration, they affirmed saying, yeah, the federal government has a right to enforce or not enforce immigration law. It's not a state thing. So states can't oppose that, and people cannot oppose that. Because if you were opposing the lawful authority of the government through means of violence, that would be considered to try to change the law or coerce them or influence policy. That would be domestic terrorism. And if you're trying to oppose the lawful authority of the government to enforce the laws, that treads into the territory of insurrection. You're now actively trying to oppose the government's authority to essentially kill two birds with one stone through the use of domestic terrorism, oppose their authority, and with a lot of these people who are like Marxists and revolutionaries, to essentially overthrow the US government because they don't like immigration policy or they don't like certain laws.
Yeah, so I know you said that you were trying to avoid engaging in that in a fallacy, but essentially you said that, quote, they weren't being tyrannical because they have a right to do what they're doing. Well, the last I checked, it was totally fine for the crown to tax without representation. It was totally fine to quarter troops. It was totally fine to suspend self government. Those things were totally valid because the crown said it was, because the authority was in the crown. And yet the founding fathers came back and said, not today, and not ever again. And that is why we have things like 2A. That's why we have the Fifth Amendment. That's why we have the 10th Amendment. And so I think you rightfully point out that just because something is said to be lawful doesn't make it right. The Patriot Act is a wonderful example of how something is legal but is clearly tyrannical. The idea that we have no right to privacy, despite the fact that we have Supreme Court cases and despite the fact that we have an entire amendment that says actually we do have such a right. And so it is a little baffling to me that you are attempting to like sidestep what I'm trying to say. Again, I'm not saying that their cause is just right or wrong. Like I'm speaking to none of it. I am trying to demonstrate for you that I believe that these people are not coming from a root of domestic terrorism. I think they're coming at it from a point of self-defense. I was not attempting to conflate. I was attempting to create an analogy for you to understand the logical reasoning behind the reason why they're in the streets yelling at ICE agents, recording ICE agents, which is totally legal, by the way. It's not even tyrannical. It is legal as long as you're not interfering with the action. But I'm going to share another source. That is showing that 2/3 of Americans now feel that ICE has gone too far. I'm using this as kind of a proxy measure to kind of demonstrate for you that the people on the left feel fundamentally that what ICE is doing is too much. And I'll point out, and I can find the source. I don't have it in front of me, but even Republican support is shifting from ICE isn't doing enough to ICE is probably going too far. And I think that we can concede, not me, I think you could concede, uh, that perhaps it was inappropriate to throw in 7,000 ICE officers or 3 or 5 or however many thousand people that weren't following basic protocol. I think that ICE would have been served better had they all already had cameras. We wouldn't have this issue. And I think that there are examples that are coming out. I think the reason we haven't heard about some of these examples around violence is because we're acting too quickly with not enough information. And and that is an example of too far, too much. It is. Um, and I'd be happy to have a 4-day conversation on the history of policing in America because criticisms against ICE are 200 years old. This debate has long existed before ICE. But this poll that I shared is really meant to show that the Democrats have a fundamental fear. They're not going out trying to blow up civilians to scare the community. They're trying to frighten the government, to let the government know that they're not going to be put down, that they're not going to let even their neighbors, legal or not illegal, uh, be impacted by what they view as tyrannical force.
Where I disagree with that is you're saying that ICE or the opposition of ICE is self-defense. I fundamentally disagree with that because saying that opposing ICE and not letting them deport illegal criminals that are in the country is somehow self-defense, I can't get behind that because then essentially where that leads to is that, oh, well, because we can let 20 plus million unknowns into the country and then we just have to accept that they're here. We can't get rid of them. No. We're going to let anybody and everybody in. So if we can let everybody in, but then we can't remove them because they're not even supposed to be here lawfully. They're not legally present here, not authorized to be here.